One peaceful morning, Sheriff Jake Thompson's quiet life is shattered by three fake HOA cops pounding on his door, demanding his arrest over a mailbox and patio chairs. What unfolds next is a battle for justice against corruption and deceit. Don't miss this jaw-dropping story. Watch till the end and share your thoughts in the comments. Make sure to like and subscribe for more thrilling stories. The unexpected visit. Sheriff Jake Thompson had always loved his quiet mornings. Nestled in his cozy recliner with a steaming cup of coffee in one hand and the TV remote in the other, life felt just about perfect. The sun had barely crept over the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow through the windows of his modest country house. Outside, the sound of birds chirping was the only noise breaking the silence. Jake took a long, satisfying sip of his coffee, savoring the rich, robust flavor. Then bam! 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 The peaceful tranquility shattered into 1,000 pieces as someone pounded on his front door like they were trying to break it down. Jake lowered his coffee mug and frowned, a deep crease forming on his forehead. He wasn't expecting visitors, much less the kind who thought assaulting his door was an acceptable greeting. Setting his coffee on the side table, he straightened his shirt and moved cautiously to the door, peeking through the window. What he saw nearly made him laugh out loud. 3 men stood on his porch, their uniforms mismatched and poorly fitting, as if they'd raided a costume shop clearance bin. The tallest of the trio, a middle-aged man with a thick mustache and mirrored sunglasses, puffed out his chest like a peacock and held up a shiny badge that looked suspiciously plastic. The man cleared his throat and adopted his most authoritative tone. "Sheriff Jake Thompson?" he demanded. Jake cocked an eyebrow. "Who's asking?" The mustached man took a step closer, giving his mirrored glasses a condescending tilt downward. "We're with the HOA enforcement unit," he declared, his voice laden with a sense of superiority. "You've violated multiple neighborhood ordinances, and we're here to take you in." Jake folded his arms, sizing up the trio with a mixture of amusement and curiosity. "The HOA has an enforcement unit now?" he asked, trying to hide his smirk. "Yes, sir," Mustache Man replied, lifting his chin higher, "and we don't tolerate non-compliance." Jake couldn't decide whether these guys were completely out of their minds or just incredibly stupid. He decided to play along, see where this bizarre situation was going. "What ordinances did I violate exactly?" he asked, suppressing a grin. The man dramatically pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket and unfolded it with exaggerated flair. "Your mailbox design," he proclaimed. "Section 4, subsection B, line 12. It does not conform to HOA's aesthetic standards." Jake glanced at his perfectly standard black mailbox standing at the edge of his driveway. "What's wrong with it?" "It's, not approved," Mustache Man declared, faltering slightly. Jake stifled a chuckle. "And what else?" "Your patio furniture," one of the lackeys chimed in, reading from his own clipboard as if reciting gospel. Jake glanced at his porch. 2 ordinary Adirondack chairs sat peacefully, looking as unimposing as could be. "What's wrong with those?" Mustache Man hesitated, clearly at a loss. "They don't match the approved color scheme," he blurted out, his confidence wavering. Jake's eyes narrowed, his posture shifting subtly. "So let me get this straight. You're arresting me for my mailbox and my patio chairs?" The mustached leader snapped, trying to regain his composure. "This isn't a joke. Non-compliance with HOA ordinances is a serious matter. You're coming with us." Jake took a slow breath and cocked his head to the side. "And where exactly are you planning to take me?" "To our holding facility," Mustache Man shot back, though his voice wavered. Jake couldn't help it. He laughed. "The HOA has a jail now?" "It's not a jail. It's a compliance center." By now, the sheer absurdity of the situation was almost too much for Jake to bear. Yet his instincts were screaming that something was off. He reached subtly for his radio, clipped to his belt, and pressed the distress signal button without breaking eye contact. Mustache Man, mistaking Jake's calm demeanor for compliance, grinned smugly. "That's right. You're learning your place," he sneered. Jake's jaw tightened, and his eyes grew colder. "Oh, I know my place," he replied. One of the lackeys moved forward with a pair of cheap, plastic-looking handcuffs. Before the man could get any closer, Jake moved. In one swift, practiced motion, he grabbed the lackey's wrist, twisted it behind his back, and slammed him onto the hood of the nearest car. The man yelped like a wounded dog, while the other two froze, too stunned to react. Mustache Man finally snapped out of his stupor. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" Jake didn't even look his way, keeping the squirming lackey pinned. "Performing a citizen's arrest," he replied dryly. The second lackey fumbled for something on his belt, but froze as the unmistakable sound of approaching sirens filled the air. A wave of red and blue lights washed over the yard as two squad cars skidded to a halt in Jake's driveway. The fake officers looked like trapped animals, their bravado vanishing in an instant. One of the real deputies stepped out, blinking in disbelief as he took in the bizarre scene. "Boss, what's going on here?" Jake gave him a wry smile. "Just handling some HOA business. Unraveling the scheme." With the fake cop still pinned to the hood, Sheriff Jake kept his grip firm, his instincts honed and razor-sharp. Deputy Carter stepped out of the patrol car, his eyes flicking between the mustached man, the squirming lackey, and Jake. Carter arched an eyebrow, smirking. "Boss, did I interrupt your morning yoga? Or are these guys just really bad at being intimidating?" Jake didn't bother hiding his grin. "These clowns claim they're from the HOA enforcement unit. Apparently, they're here to arrest me for mailbox and patio chair violations." Carter let out a low whistle. "HOA enforcement unit, huh? That's a new one." The mustached man finally snapped out of his daze, his cheeks flushing with embarrassment and anger. "You don't understand. We have legal authority. This man violated multiple community standards." Carter strolled over, giving the so-called officer a critical once-over. "Let me see that badge." Reluctantly, Mustache Man handed over the shiny trinket. Carter inspected it, holding back laughter. "Where'd you pick this up, buddy?" "Dollar store? Because it sure as hell ain't issued by any legitimate authority." The other two imposters exchanged worried glances, sensing their illusion of power crumbling around them. Carter handed the badge back with a smirk, pulling out his own. "Here's a real one. You might want to take notes." Jake glanced toward the SUV the imposters had arrived in. "Carter, check the vehicle. Something tells me these boys have more than just fake badges to worry about." As Carter popped the trunk and began rifling through the contents, Jake kept his attention on Mustache Man. "So, mind telling me who gave you this big promotion to HOA enforcer?" The man grumbled something under his breath, his bravado clearly faltering. Before he could respond, Carter whistled loudly from the back of the SUV. "Boss, you're going to want to see this." Jake moved to the rear of the vehicle, eyes narrowing as Carter held up a stack of pre-written tickets. Some filled out, some blank, all with HOA violations ranging from unapproved window treatments to non-standard lawn ornaments. Next to the pile was a cash box overflowing with bills. Jake flipped through the ticket book. Hundreds of fines. Looks like these guys have been busy. Carter pulled out another item, a neatly kept ledger with names and addresses of homeowners, each marked with dates and the amounts collected. They've been hitting the whole neighborhood. Looks like they were planning on expanding to nearby communities, too. One entry caught Jake's eye, a particularly hefty fine next to Mrs. Harlan's name, a sweet old lady who baked pies for the entire street. "You fine Mrs. Harlan for having garden gnomes?" Jake growled. The mustached man tried to maintain his composure. "Those statues were unsightly and disrupted the visual harmony of the neighborhood," Jake scoffed. "Disrupted harmony, huh? She's 84 and decorates her garden with 2 ceramic ducks. You really think that's worth a $100 fine?" Before Mustache Man could retort, Carter lifted another notebook, this one filled with detailed plans on how to intimidate homeowners into compliance. Scripts, word-for-word threats, even a checklist of intimidation tactics to make fines stick. "Boss, they've been targeting vulnerable folks, single moms, the elderly, people they figured wouldn't fight back." Carter shook his head, disgusted. Just as Jake was about to cuff the man himself, another car pulled up, a sleek black SUV with tinted windows. Out stepped Walter Smith, the HOA president himself, flanked by 2 well-dressed men who looked more like lawyers than community volunteers. Smith raised his voice with forced authority. Sheriff Thompson, what exactly is going on here? Jake gave him a cold, steely look. I could ask you the same thing. Your goons just tried to arrest me over a mailbox. Smith put on his best innocent smile, oozing false charm. There must be some misunderstanding. These men are simply volunteers helping maintain community standards. Volunteers, huh? Carter interjected, holding up the cash box. You usually pay volunteers in cash and let them carry fake badges around? Smith's smile faded, but he quickly regained his composure. Any collected funds go directly into the HOA's community maintenance budget. This is perfectly within our rights as laid out by the HOA charter. Jake glanced at Carter, who nodded almost imperceptibly, understanding the sheriff's unspoken command to keep digging. Turning back to Smith, Jake smirked. And did that charter authorize your men to impersonate law enforcement and extort money from residents? Smith hesitated just a beat too long. They're not impersonating anyone. They're compliance officers. Jake stepped closer, his presence intimidating. You better start telling me the truth, or things are going to get real uncomfortable for you. Real fast. One of Smith's lawyer cronies whispered something in his ear, but Smith brushed him off, confident in his arrogance. You don't have jurisdiction over HOA matters, Sheriff. Our charter gives us authority. Jake pulled out his radio. Funny thing about that, see, impersonating law enforcement is a state crime, and so is extortion. That's way out of your little charter's reach. At that moment, another deputy pulled up, this time with a laptop in hand. Got the financial records you asked for, Sheriff, he announced, and you're going to want to see this. Jake scanned the data, his eyes widening as he saw massive transactions siphoned from HOA funds to private accounts linked to Smith and a few other board members. There was more. Direct payments to the fake enforcement crew as contracted compliance officers. He turned back to Smith, his tone ice cold. Looks like you've been skimming money from the HOA and running a fake compliance racket. Care to explain that? Smith finally lost his calm demeanor, his face blanching. This is outrageous. You can't prove anything. Jake signaled Carter, who held up the ledger. Funny thing, your boys kept pretty good records. Names, dates, amounts, all of it. Plus, it looks like you've been threatening residents with foreclosure if they didn't pay up. Smith's face twisted with anger and panic, realizing the net was closing around him. Jake took a deliberate step closer. You're done, Walter. Fraud, embezzlement, impersonating law enforcement. You're looking at serious time. Smith tried one last desperate play, raising his voice for the crowd gathering nearby. This is all a mistake. He's trying to take over the HOA. He's abusing his power. But the crowd wasn't buying it. Murmurs of anger rose from the neighbors, stories surfacing about their own encounters with the fake cops and unfair fines. Jake raised his voice loud and clear. If anyone here has been forced to pay fines or threatened with legal action by these so-called enforcement officers, step forward. Your receipts and statements will help us put these frauds behind bars. One by one, people moved closer, clutching evidence and sharing stories of intimidation. Smith's face fell, realizing he was surrounded by the very people he had exploited. Carter moved in with the cuffs, snapping them onto Smith's wrists. Walter Smith, you're under arrest for fraud, extortion, and impersonation of law enforcement. As they hauled Smith and his cronies away, Jake glanced at the gathered neighbors, giving a nod of reassurance. It's over. You're safe now. But something told Jake that this conspiracy ran deeper than just the HOA board. And as he watched Smith being led away, he couldn't help but wonder, who else had been complicit in this grand scheme? The storm breaks. As the dust settled on the chaotic morning, Sheriff Jake Thompson couldn't shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at his gut. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that taking down Smith and his cronies was too easy. Something about the whole operation felt off, as if Smith was just a front man, a puppet dancing to someone else's strings. Just then, his radio crackled to life. Sheriff, we've got a problem down at the county records office, Deputy Carter reported, tension thick in his voice. Someone broke in and wiped the HOA's financial database clean. Every digital record is gone. Jake's jaw tightened, his instincts screaming that this went way beyond just HOA thugs. "I'm on my way. Keep everyone off the crime scene. No one touches anything until I get there." He hopped into his patrol truck and sped down the quiet suburban streets, thoughts racing. He couldn't help but wonder, who would be desperate enough to cover their tracks like this? More importantly, why? Deception runs deep. As Jake pulled up to the records office, he found Carter pacing near the entrance, his face a grim mask. "Boss," Carter greeted him. "It's bad. Real bad." Jake stepped inside, immediately noticing shattered glass from a busted window and wires hanging out of smashed computer terminals. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were after. A tech specialist from the department, Lisa, was already there, hunched over a salvaged hard drive. "What do we have?" Jake asked, leaning in to get a better look. Lisa didn't look up. "Someone used a sophisticated wiping program. It's military grade, Sheriff. Whoever did this wasn't just some HOA goon. This is professional." That hit Jake like a punch to the gut. "Military grade? You sure?" Lisa nodded, showing him the remnants of the code on her laptop. "No HOA member could afford this. It's high-level stuff, like something the feds would use to clear classified data." Jake shared a look with Carter. "Someone's protecting more than just HOA money laundering. Someone with power and resources." Carter frowned. Maybe the HOA was just a front for something bigger. Maybe Smith wasn't calling the shots after all. A sudden thought hit Jake like a freight train. He grabbed his phone and dialed Mrs. Harlan, the elderly lady whose garden gnomes had triggered one of the bogus fines. No answer. He tried her neighbor, Mrs. Rollins. "Sheriff?" Mrs. Rollins sounded breathless. "Oh, thank God you called. They took her." Jake's stomach dropped. "Who took her?" "A bunch of men in black suits. Said they were with the government, took her right out of her house. Said it was an investigation matter. I tried to call you, but they threatened me." Jake clenched his teeth, trying to control his growing fury. Mrs. Harlan? An investigation? She couldn't even drive, much less be involved in something shady. He ended the call, turning to Carter. "Someone's kidnapping witnesses. We're up against something way bigger than HOA extortion. Into the lion's den." Jake knew there was one place that might still hold answers. Smith's house. If there was anything worth hiding, it would be there. He called for backup and headed straight to the upscale cul-de-sac, where Smith's mansion loomed like a modern castle. When he pulled up, he noticed something was off. The lights were on, but no movement inside. Carter and two other deputies joined him, and they made their way cautiously to the front door, finding it slightly ajar. Jake signaled with his hand, and the deputies moved in. As they entered, a foul metallic smell hit their noses. In the foyer lay two bodies, men in tactical gear, clearly not HOA volunteers. Blood pooled on the marble floor and bullet casings littered the ground. Carter scanned the room, eyes wide. "Boss, this is a hit. Someone's cleaning house." Suddenly, Jake heard a noise from the upstairs study. He signaled Carter to cover him and crept up the staircase. As he reached the study door, he heard muffled voices. Pressing his ear to the door, he caught snippets of a heated argument. One voice, low and menacing. "You were supposed to keep it under wraps. Now the sheriff's got enough to bury us all." A panicked reply. "We didn't know he'd push this far. The HOA was just supposed to be a money funnel. It wasn't supposed to get this messy." Before Jake could act, gunfire erupted inside the room. He kicked the door open just in time to see a man in a tailored suit crumple to the floor, bleeding out. The other man in a dark coat spun around, gun raised. Jake fired first, his shot catching the man in the shoulder. The gunman fell back, dropping his weapon. Jake rushed over, cuffing the man's hands behind his back as Carter stormed in. Carter glanced at the bleeding body on the floor. "That's Councilman Frank Howell," he whispered, stunned. "He's on the town council, one of Smith's biggest supporters." Jake pulled the injured man upright, ignoring his groans. "Talk, now!" The man gritted his teeth, trying to act tough despite the pain. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Sheriff. HOA funds were just the start. Howell was laundering campaign money through the HOA, funneling it through fake fines and neighborhood projects. That old lady, she knew too much. Smith was just a pawn." Jake's mind reeled at the revelation. "And who are you?" The man gave a sick smile. Smith's cleaner. My job was to erase anything that could implicate the councilman. You showing up just made it more complicated. Just then, Jake's phone buzzed. A text from the station. The feds were on their way, tipped off by someone higher up. They were claiming jurisdiction and demanding the entire case be handed over. Jake looked at Carter, feeling a cold dread settle in. This goes deeper than we thought. If the feds take over, this whole thing might get buried. Carter nodded grimly. We've got to move fast, boss. If we don't lock down evidence and witnesses before they arrive, this whole thing gets swept under the rug. Just then his radio crackled. Sheriff, we've got unmarked vehicles circling the station. Looks like federal agents. They're demanding we hand over all evidence immediately. Jake knew he was running out of time. Secure what you can. Make copies of every record and back it up to the cloud. We're not losing this case to some cover-up. As he dragged the injured hitman down the stairs, he caught sight of the dawn breaking through the mansion windows. A new day was coming, but with it, the weight of uncovering the truth, and knowing that someone, somewhere, was willing to kill to keep it buried. The reckoning Sheriff Jake Thompson knew he had only one shot to get the truth out before the feds took over and buried everything. As the sun broke over the horizon, he formulated a plan. The injured hitman was loaded into the back of the patrol car, still cuffed and wincing in pain. Carter gave Jake a wary glance. Boss, we gotta move fast. Those unmarked cars just pulled into the station parking lot, Carter reported. Jake nodded, determination hardening his jawline. Get the copies of the files and evidence to the safe house on Route 9. I'll buy us some time here. Carter hesitated. You sure about this? They're not gonna like us holding out on them. Jake gave him a grim smile. We've been chasing the truth this far. No sense stopping now. As Carter took off, Jake made a quick call to Deputy Lisa, instructing her to secure the station and make sure no one handed over evidence without his explicit approval. Then he turned back to the bleeding hitman. You're going to give me names, every last one of them. Councilmen, state officials, whoever's pulling the strings, Jake growled. The man gave a pained chuckle. Doesn't matter what you know, Sheriff. You'll be dead before noon. Jake leaned in closer. You think I'm scared of a bunch of politicians and their hired thugs? You don't know me. Now start talking before I decide to let the locals deal with you. The hitman hesitated, sweat beading on his forehead. All right. The whole operation was Howell's idea, but he wasn't the mastermind. The HOA was a front for laundering campaign funds, funneled through community fines, fake violations, and inflated contracts. But Howell was just a pawn. The real brains are higher up, state level. You take me in, I'm a dead man. Jake processed the information, knowing it would implicate prominent political figures. Who's pulling Howell's strings? Governor Stenson, the man whispered, barely audible. He's the one who signed off on the whole scheme, kept the cash flowing through HOA fines, and redirected the funds to his re-election campaign. You go after him, you're dead. Showdown at the station. Just as Jake processed the bombshell revelation, his radio crackled again. Sheriff, the feds are getting pushy. They're threatening to charge obstruction if we don't hand over the files, Lisa reported. Jake grimaced, knowing time was running out. Lisa, copy everything to a secure drive and stash it at the safe house. Tell Carter to secure the hard copies too. Then hold tight. He looked down at the hitman, making a quick decision. You're coming with me? You're going to repeat every word you just said to me on record. As he drove back to the station, his phone buzzed. An unknown number. Jake hesitated but picked up. A smooth, authoritative voice greeted him. Sheriff Thompson, this is Director Alan Morris of the FBI. I understand you've detained one of our suspects. You're instructed to release him into federal custody immediately. Jake gritted his teeth. Your suspect just implicated the governor in a massive fraud and money laundering operation. You can understand if I'm not too keen on handing him over. The director's tone dropped to icy professionalism. Sheriff, you're playing a dangerous game. I suggest you cooperate before things escalate. This is beyond your jurisdiction. Jake smirked. Funny thing about justice, it doesn't care much about jurisdiction. You want my suspect? Come get him. He hung up and floored the gas pedal, determined to get back before the feds. A town united. When Jake pulled into the station lot, he saw a line of unmarked SUVs and men in suits already confronting his deputies. Lisa stood on the steps, her hand on her belt, staring down an agent who looked like he was seconds from losing his temper. As Jake stepped out, the lead agent, a tall man with a clean-shaven face and piercing blue eyes, approached him. "Sheriff Thompson, we're here to take your suspect into federal custody," he announced. Jake kept his expression unreadable. "You got a warrant?" The agent hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "Federal jurisdiction supersedes local authority. Hand him over." "Not without a warrant," Jake countered. "Last I checked, we're not in a dictatorship." The agent bristled, but before he could respond, a surprising sight caught everyone's attention. A large group of townsfolk had gathered outside the station, neighbors, business owners, and families, holding up signs reading, "Justice for our town," and "Sheriff Jake stands for us." An older man from the crowd stepped forward. "You can't just take him, Agent. That sheriff's the only one who ever fought for this town." The agent sneered. "This is federal business. Move aside." Just then, Carter pulled up with the files, giving Jake a nod. Jake raised his voice for everyone to hear. "This man right here," Jake pointed to the hitman in cuffs, "just implicated Governor Stenson in a statewide money laundering operation, using our HOA as a front. These agents want to bury it. I say no." The crowd erupted in angry shouts, demanding answers and justice. The federal agents looked uneasy as townspeople edged closer, unwilling to let their sheriff be steamrolled. Suddenly, Jake heard clapping from behind him. He turned to see the county DA, Amelia Rhodes, striding up with a grim look on her face. "Agent," she called out, "I just got an emergency injunction from the state court. You're not taking anyone until we get a full accounting of the allegations. I also called the state attorney general's office. They're sending their own investigators. This isn't just your jurisdiction anymore." The lead agent looked furious, but he knew he was outmaneuvered. "You're making a mistake," he hissed. "Maybe," Jake shot back, "but I'd rather make a mistake trying to do what's right than bury the truth for convenience." The aftermath. In the weeks that followed, the story broke wide open. Multiple news outlets picked up the story, with evidence pouring in from witnesses and whistleblowers, emboldened by the sheriff's stand. The governor's office issued frantic denials, but as more documents surfaced, the walls began to close in. Governor Stenson eventually resigned in disgrace, charged with conspiracy and money laundering. Smith and his fake HOA enforcers received lengthy prison sentences, while the townsfolk celebrated the return of their stolen money and the dismantling of the corrupt HOA regime. One afternoon, as Jake sat on his porch, finally enjoying his long-delayed cup of coffee, Carter pulled up, leaning out of his truck with a sly grin. "Boss, guess who's running for mayor?" Jake shot him a glare. "Don't even think about it." Carter laughed. "People are serious this time. They want someone who's got their back, someone they trust." Jake just shook his head, a slow smile forming. "I'm a sheriff, Carter. I don't do politics." "But you do justice," Carter shot back. "And right now, that's what this town needs. Think about it." Jake leaned back, eyes on the horizon, knowing that protecting his town might just take a new form. He wasn't sure about being mayor, but he knew one thing. He'd never stop fighting for what was right. A legacy of courage. As the sun dipped below the hills, Jake's phone buzzed. It was a text from Mrs. Harlan, finally back home and safe. "Sheriff, thank you for protecting us. I made you a pie. Come by anytime." Jake couldn't help but chuckle. He glanced at Carter, who gave him a knowing look. "Maybe being mayor wouldn't be so bad," Jake muttered, more to himself than anyone else. In that moment, he knew the battle for justice was never truly over. But with the support of his community, he was ready for whatever came next.